when a guard would stop and talk to you, you used to stand back and you would yell so people could hear what you were saying to that guard as they walked by or within the vicinity.
But he knew what a convict was going to do before they thought of it themselves. He'd just been around that long, and he was tough.
They'd find Sparky in about every conceivable place you could imagine, which we would, of course, dump.
They'd wait until everybody was locked up, and he would open his door and run down to cell 1 and get a bugler can full of Sparky and take it back to his cells.
She had a kind of a hypnotic power. There were a great many wild cats around the penitentiary, and most people couldn't get near them. But she would stand in the doorway of the cell house and say, "Kitty, kitty, kitty," and those cats would go to her.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Stool Pigeon Saturday. This is Anthony, and I'm excited to have a special guest. The author of Diamondfield, Finding the Real Jack Davis, Max Black, is here in the trenches with me to talk about Diamondfield Jack. So welcome, Max.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I almost feel like him.
Right? Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting thing as you research some of these prisoners, how much detail you can learn about somebody's life from their intake files and letters to and from family members. And
it has been amazing to me, the amount of information that I have been able to gather. I have gathered over 300 newspaper articles from around the United States about this man.
It's amazing. And as far as reaching as like New York, this story was all across the country. It's incredible. And the love of like Western lore. I mean, it's such a good story of cowmen and shepherds and everything else. So I think just to begin, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? Were you born and raised here in Idaho?
No, I was born and raised in Delta, Utah, which is in the western part of Utah near Ely, Nevada. I mean, a little bit east of Ely, Nevada. And then I went to University of Utah. After I graduated, I worked in Salt Lake for 6 or 7 years, and then was transferred to Boise, and that was in 1968. I worked with insurance companies here in western Idaho. I traveled around western Idaho every 2 weeks. I'd go to Twin Falls, Burley, up at McCall and up in that area and Caldwell. And so I had this somewhat regular route that I'd take every other week. Uh-huh. And how I ran across Diamondfield Jack is that one time I received an inquest or a request from an agent in California that had needed to buy insurance for a group of college professors that had come up to Albion, Idaho, and leased the old Albion State College. And so I went down there to make a fire inspection and a liability inspection. And as you drive into Albion, and it's there today, there is a placard there on the city square about Diamondfield Jack. And I stopped and read it, and it was kind of interesting. As I read it, and as I look back on it, there was something that struck me about the article and about the name and whatever else. And as time has gone on, I have kind of figured out why that familiarity may have existed. I became curious. It talked about these 2 sheep herders that were found dead in the wagon, about this Diamondfield Jack Davis was his name, and how he had been tried and convicted of killing these 2 young men. Mm-hmm. Well, as I traveled again back and forth down through Twin Falls, and I started to run across his name again and again. Uh-huh. There's a bar in Twin Falls, Jack Davis Bar, and up at the ski resort, there's a Jack Davis Park. And so the curiosity was aroused, and I have been all of my life a Civil War nut. I have made 15 or more trips back to the Civil War country, and my interest, for whatever reason, is that when I read an article or some information about the Civil War, I wanted to know where that happened.
Yeah.
I wanted to be able to go back and stand on the spot where it happened and find it. This curiosity about these two sheep herders, I wanted to know where did that happen.
Yeah.
And so inquiring from people in Twin Falls, Burley, Rupert, or all of that area, everybody had a little different idea of where it happened.
Yeah.
And none of it matched. And so over the years, my curiosity just kind of remained there. And one session at the legislature.
And just so you listeners know, Max Black served as the member of the Idaho House of Representatives from District 15, which was the area in Boise south of Shindon, roughly between Eagle Road and Maple Grove up to I-84. He served as a representative from December 1st, 1992 through December 1st, 2012.
In the legislature, towards the end of the session, you'll find periods of time where you may wait for a whole half a day before something else happens. You have to be there or available. But this one year, we were having these long delays. And I, just out of curiosity, I says, I'm going to go over to the city library and see if I can find anything on Diamondfield Jack, which I did. And when I got over there, the only thing they had was what they referred to as a drop file. Okay. And there was some newspaper articles and some other information, but it wasn't very enlightening or very detailed. And so I accumulated that, and I had on several occasions gone to Burley and to Albion trying to find the original court records.
Right.
Which should still exist.
Yeah.
Albion was the county seat at the time, but it had been transferred to Burley, being the county seat. And all of the papers transferred to Oakley. I'd get up to Oakley, and they were never able to find any detail about the trial.
Right.
And they also just had a drop file. And there would be some newspaper articles. I got to know the county clerk down there real well, and between the two of us, we did quite a bit of searching. But we're never able to find anything, and he started to think that the information probably had been transported to the state capitol historical society.
Yeah.
So I came up here and started to search, and Rod House at the time was the curator, and he and I, on a number of occasions, would go out into the archives, and he did all kinds of research, and we never could find any substantial information on Diamondfield Jack. And this one day, I was out there talking to Rod, and we had gone out into the archives records and came back, and we're standing there in the hallway, and a young girl come walking up to us, and she had known me as a page in the legislature. She says, Representative Black, what are you doing out here? And we told her what we were doing, and Rod mentioned that we've been out looking for records on Diamondfield Jack, but just doesn't seem to be any. And she said, oh, yeah, there's a lot. And he says, what do you mean? He says, oh. And so she turned around and walked back into the archives and walked right to a orange crate full of records on
Just the
Diamondfield
trove.
Jack.
Yeah. Wow. Okay.
And we, of course, retrieved them. And so they set up a special room there in the Historical Society, and this was going to take substantial time to go through all these records, and so they were kind enough to set them aside and not put them away every time I came out, because I couldn't go out and spend lots of time. We were partly still in the legislature at this particular time. Mm-hmm. And so I'd go out and spend an hour or 2 hours or whatever and copying. I copied, which they allowed me to do, and I paid for each copy. And so I accumulated basically all that they had, which I've got them all at my house. I've got over 24 three-ring binders full of information on Diamondfield Jack that I've accumulated going to Diamondfield, Tonopah, Nevada, in their museums, and they are kind, reproduce everything for me. Yeah. So I've got an archive at my house on Diamondfield Jack.
And when did you start this, like collecting all this?
Well, it would have been probably in about 2006 or 7.
Okay, yeah.
I finally started to accumulate it and organize it. And I first had never really thought about writing a book, but the more information I got and more detailed information I got, it became the idea to put it into a story form. And so I started to do that in 2009. And I worked on it off and on, and I finally published it in 2013.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So as a result of the research and the coincidences, so to speak, that I have encountered, it almost makes me sometimes think that, Diamondfield Jack may have been there helping me.
Yeah, you were like destined to uncover this story. Yeah.
And one of those coincidences, as I mentioned when I first read the information about it, it sounded somewhat familiar. And as I researched further, I discovered that Diamondfield Jack had developed a mine 7 miles from my father's mine.
Oh, my gosh.
Back in the late 40s.
Wow.
And my dad had mining property and spent the good part of his life out in the hills west of Delta and near the Nevada border, where Diamondfield Jack at the time had gone to a place in western Utah called Gold Hill. At the time it was developed, gold mining and whatever, and he had become interested in it somehow. We don't know all the details of that, but I have been able to find some research on some people that knew him while he was there. But this mine that he had was within 7 miles of my dad's. Now, knowing my dad lived out in those hills, and if there's anybody out there to be known, my dad would get to know him. I am sure.
Yeah.
And so I'm thinking that my dad met him, talked to him, and knew the story and repeated it when I was a 10, 12-year-old kid.
Jeez.
And that somewhat stuck with me. But then one of the other coincidences, and this doesn't have really anything to do with it other than the fact that it was a real coincidence. I was 13 years old, and we had gone to Santa Monica, California to visit my sister living in Southern California for Christmas. This was in 1948 and 1949. Well, the Rose Parade was on January 1st, and we stayed down there and watched that. And then the morning of January 2nd, we left and drove back to where we were from, Delta, Utah. Well, on that particular day, Diamondfield Jack, or Jack Davis, had been ran over by a taxi on the 28th of December, and then died right in that period of time. But he was buried in the cemetery in Las Vegas, right along the highway, and we drove past it.
So you got a glimpse of the funeral happening.
I don't have any recollection
Right,
of
yeah.
that happening, but just the fact that we drove past there that day, the day it happened. And I've been back to the site, and the highway is still there. Everything's still the same.
Mm-hmm.
If you'd have looked, you'd have been able to see right where he was buried.
Yeah.
So that is just one of those curious things that you remember.
Definitely.
And but anyway, as I started to research this and wanted to find out where did this incident happen, the first clue was over at the library, and a newspaper article written by a historian from Twin Falls area. In 1936, he had written a newspaper article in the Statesman, and in it, he was describing the incident, and he made mention in there that this happened south of Twin Falls, approximately 1,000 feet west of the Magic Hot Springs Road, which still exists. Oh, and it says that the area is marked by a loosely stacked rock monument.
Yeah.
Well, so I go back to that area, and one of the individuals that live in that area is Alex Kunkel. He's on the board of directors of the Twin Falls County Museum, and I contacted him with the information that we had there. We went out searching in that area for it, but we never could find anything, because there were even people down there that had ideas, as we found out, of where it happened. And they would tell us, and we'd go there and never could find anything that was west of the Hot Springs Road, nor any kind of a rock monument type thing. The information that they had at the Idaho Historical Society was not the trial papers of the Cassia County. They were the legal papers of James Hawley.
Gotcha. Yeah, defense attorney.
The defense attorney.
Yeah.
And so they were under his name and not Diamondfield Jack. But that's this young girl had somehow looked in this box and had been curious and determined that it involved Jack. And it was all of his legal papers of his defense of Jack Davis.
That's great.
And it takes literally hours and hours to reread and to try to follow the sequence. The papers were not necessarily in sequential order, and so I just study and read, and one day I read about a testimony of a surveyor that had been hired by Hawley to go down to the area. The general site where this happened is at the Sparks Herald Cattle Company, operated approximately 100 miles square, which ran from the border of Utah into almost to Winnemucca, Nevada, up into Idaho, the Waihees, over to Twin Falls, and back down along the Utah border.
And was this like a legally plotted out, or was this just open land that they kind of...
Well, when they went there, it was open land. In 1871, a person by the name Harold, he had a nickname called Barley Harold, but that wasn't his name. It was a habit that he had. He always carried a sack of barley or oats on his saddle to feed his horse. And they referred to him. Anyway, the attorney, who was Senator William Borah, which was at the time a young, inspiring attorney in Idaho, this helped make his name in Idaho, this trial. The testimony and the witnesses that Bora had brought into the trial when they were trying Diamondfield Jack, they mentioned 5 different locations that were 5 different working ranches of the Sparks Herald operation. He had 25 working ranches in this 100 miles.
Yeah.
And so they hired McClellan, was his name, a surveyor, to go down and measure the distances between what was called the Boar's Nest, the Sanseco Ranch, the Brown Ranch, the Circle, or the Point of the Mountain Ranch, up to the site of the killing.
Yeah.
And he had these measurements in the testimony.
Wow. So it kind of coordinated it out for you.
So I got an engineer named David Curtis, and we read through them, and we went down to these ranches and triangulated.
Wow.
And by using the miles from these different ranches, and he said that they were from the ranch house of these 5 different ranches, and luckily 4 of them still exist. The ranch house still exists. We went down to these 5 locations, took readings with his GPS, and then we went back up to the general area.
Wow.
And it took us 3 hours of triangulating, going from one spot, and we finally came to a spot. And Dave said, "This is where the wagon set."
Wow. Oh my gosh.
And so I said, okay, well, there's one more measurement then we've got to do. Now, there wasn't any loosely stacked monument around, but over, about 300 feet from it was. And what it wasn't a monument per se, but in those days, they would go in and take a small spring, and they would develop it. And so they would dig down 20, 30 feet, take all of the rocks out of it, make it a pool, and these rocks were just stacked around it. And so it looked like a deliberate stacking of rocks. We went back out to the Magic Hot Springs Road, and the first description of where he said it was approximately 1,000 feet west of the Magic Hot Springs Road. We went out there in the middle of the road, took a reading, walked back to the site that we said was it, and it was 1,038 feet.
Oh my gosh.
Okay. And then this loosely stacked rock was about 300 feet away from it, but you could see it from there. So with that, the other thing that was of real interest when we got out there, after kind of making a little marker there, we wanted to come back the next week with metal detectors, Alex Kunkel and I. And while I was back home, I remembered in the testimony of the owner of the wagon that these 2 young men were killed in, they testified at the trial that there were 6 shots fired, 3 of them into the bodies of the men, and 1 of them up through the top of the wagon, 1 down through the tongue of the wagon that settled into an oil can, a coal oil can. And the 6th one out about 2 rods out north of the wagon through the side of a saddle. They were asked, well, this bullet, or what do you think was a bullet hole? What made you think it was a bullet hole? And they said, well, it was the collective conclusion of all of us, the sheriff and whatever. The leather was pushed in on the front side and pushed out on the outside. So it was concluded that it was a bullet that had gone through it. And they said, well, did you look in the ground under it? And they said, no, we didn't think of that. And when I read that a year or so earlier, I had written in the column, so the bullet is still there.
Yeah.
And so I went back, found that information, and metal detectors the next week. We went out, and Alex and I, starting out around the campsite, we found some old metal cans, and on one side we filled a wagon set here on facing the north, and these two, the cans were just outside what we think would have been the door on the left side of the door, and then we found some bolts and a couple of wagon parts on the other side where apparently they had, worked on something. And so then I said, okay, I'm going to go out there about 2 rods, which is approximately 32 feet, with my metal detector and look for that bullet.
Yeah.
So I went out there, and it said that it had been stretched over a sagebrush. And I get out there and I start looking around, and looked over a little bit to my right, and there was a sagebrush.
Yeah.
Growing up in the middle of what is called a lava flow. And there are those broken rocks, but what was a stream of lava, and then dried and cracked and broke. But anyway, a sagebrush was growing up out of there, and my thought at the time was, well, that could have been a great-great-granddaughter of the original sagebrush.
From the 1890s.
1890s.
Yeah, wow.
And so I walked around to the other side of it, where the saddle would have been stretched over it. I put my metal detector down, and boom, it just sounded right.
Wow.
And I got down on my knee, started scraping the dirt away, and about 2 inches under the ground, laying on a rock, was that bullet.
Jeez.
And the coincidence of that, we've taken it to bullet experts, ballistic experts, and they conclude that, yes, it was a .44 caliber bullet made prior to 1900. And there's a difference in bullets pre-1900 and post. And it's the composition of the bullet.
Yeah.
And this was strictly the bullets of the pre-1900. So we can conclude, not absolutely, but it's pretty evident that was the bullet.
Yeah.
Another discovery, that one of those coincidences that you can't explain. I had a friend that lived here in Boise. He was a machinist, and he did work for me periodically. And I took a piece of metal over to him to have him cut it off to fit on a particular saw that I had bought. And he cut it off for me, and it's at his home. We sat down there on the back porch afterwards, and he asked me, he says, how's your story coming? Because I had talked to him about it. And I says, oh, it's fine. I'm getting ready to publish it. And I said, did I ever tell you that I found one of the bullets? And he said, no. So I told him the story of finding this bullet. And he, even to this day, he says that as I was telling him about this story, he said, the hair on the back of my neck, I know, raised.
Yeah.
And the next thing he said to me, he says, Max, I have that gun. And I says, what would make you think you have that gun? And he says, well, tell me again where it happened. And I told him. And he said, I have a friend that had recently passed away here a year or so ago, and his mother brought this gun to me and said, we don't know what it is, why. We just know that he found it down there near Rogerson, but we don't know anything about it. But since you collect guns, we want to give it to you, being a friend. It was a .44 caliber, model 1878 Colt .44 caliber gun.
Yeah.
We looked up the history on it, and it was a designed specifically for an under-the-shoulder holster gun.
Yeah.
Well, as the story evolves, and the two individuals that ultimately confessed to killing the two sheep herders, he testified that he owned a Model 78 44 caliber under the shoulder holster gun that he was used at the time this all happened, and that the sheep herder, the young sheep herder, had wrestled him to the floor, and he was trying to get this gun out to protect himself, and the young man took it away from him and obviously shot it a couple of times. One of them down through the tongue and the one out through the saddle. And so he testified that he had lost the gun. Well, in reality, we all believe that he threw the gun away after the incident happened. And one of the curious things about it, it's all rusted, but it's covered with minerals, which indicates that it was thrown into water and set there. And so it was just right near where the incident happened, and it's right near where Dick said he found it. Again, there was only 2,100 of these guns made over a 25-year period, shipped all over the United States. The likelihood of that being a gun, again, is very high.
Right, yeah. That I remember reading that and just like pulling my hair out going, oh my gosh, Max, are you kidding me? This is crazy, all these coincidences.
It's the coincidences are just insane.
Yeah.
So with those curious facts, the story, just takes on a whole different meaning and interest. And then above the story of those facts, the story of Jack Davis himself is a real curiosity. Jack Davis, we do not know that was his name.
Right.
We've never been able to do any tracking down, except just this morning I looked on my internet, and there is a note from a lady in Los Angeles that has been working with me for 4 or 5 years, and she's introducing me to a genealogist in Phoenix, Arizona, that she feels will be able to track down Diamondfield Jack. With the evidence that we've got. That and she is a professional at it. So maybe we'll be able to really find out what his name was, where he is from, and whatever.
I can only imagine. I spent hours and hours looking up all of his different aliases, John and Frank Woodson. And, I found all these individuals with those names from West Virginia and from New Jersey, and some that were in California, but none of them quite.
It just doesn't when he was in prison in Yuma, Arizona. He said he was from Wheeling, West Virginia.
Right.
And then he told his sheriff, while he was in jail in Albion, his daughter, who used to bring him his meals, that he was born in the same state, in the same county that Jefferson Davis was born in.
Right,
So he was known to be, an exaggerator, and exaggerated on all kinds of things. But the story of Jack Davis, our first knowledge of him was in Silver City, Idaho, if you know where that is. And then in 1892, there was a diamond rush out in Owyhee County, and they had a great furor about diamonds, in which they were not diamonds, they were silicone crystals. But nonetheless, it aroused the countryside. A lot of them were sold as diamonds, and Jack Davis came down to that area and found some of those same crystals and carried them with him and claimed that they were diamonds, and that's how he picked up the name Diamondfield Jack.
I love that.
which went with him to his dying day.
Yeah, in his obituary. It's
Yeah. So anyway, Jack Davis shows up working for the Sparks Herald Cattle Company at the time that the sheep herders were moving into Oakley, Idaho, and they were starting to move their sheep westward into what Sparks Herald considered their prime grazing lands. And so we developed the classic cattleman sheep herder conflict and war. And as that developed, Sparks hired Jack Davis to be a range rider in that area, attempting to keep the sheep herders from coming onto their land. Well, in the process of this, Jack Davis, his method was to ride into a camp, and generally they were younger sheep herders hired by the sheep owners, and he would sit down and even have dinner with them, lunch, but then he would leave a threat, and one like, are you working for William Tolman? And they'd say no. And they'd say, well, it's a good thing, because if you were, I'd have to run you off this property, and there may be gunfire, and he'd try to scare them. Well, William Tolman heard these stories, and he, in return, he was a large man and somewhat of a blowhard himself. And so, bragging to some of these younger sheep herders, he said, well, if this guy wants to confront me, I'll go down and confront him. And so he had these 3 or 4 young sheep herders sitting on a ridge looking down at the cabin where Jack Davis was staying. And he rode down and approached the cabin, and Jack Davis came out, and Tolman said, understand you're, threatening me or whatever. And as the conversation goes, Tolman was sitting on his horse with his rifle. Now, this is the story that has developed. Davis tells that story, and the younger men have later verified it. But anyway, he's with his gun over his saddle horn. And so anyway, he gets in this little bit of a conversation with Jack Davis, and he said he made a move to get down off from his horse, and in doing so swung his rifle around, which startled Jack Davis.
Right.
And he quickly pulled the gun and shot him in the shoulder. Well, when he got down off his horse, of course, he's not in a condition to do anything about it. So then he starts to plead for his life. And Davis put him back on his horse, took him back up to these young sheep herders, and told them to take him to a doctor. He needed medical assistance, which they did. Well, but then Tolman's story of it, of course, was that Jack Davis just shot him, and so
left him out all day in the sun, and he was discovered half dead, and just like
so anyway, a warrant is issued for Jack Davis, and so Jack leaves southern Idaho and heads for Nevada. Works down there for only until January, when apparently these young men, then the story got out and the sheriff heard the true story, and so they just dropped the warrant for his arrest. So Jack Davis heard about it, and so then he starts to work his way back up into Idaho. And on his way back up, he visited a couple of these ranches. The night before this all happened, he claims him and a partner were out looking for horses, which was a practice at the time. The ranchers down there didn't have at the time a lot of hay fields and a lot of winter feed. So they'd take their horses during the wintertime and turn them loose onto the range so that the horses could forage for themselves. And then during the early spring, they would have these individuals that these people would go out and round up all these horses, and the horses would be branded, and then bring them back and be paid to retrieve the horses.
Yeah.
Well, they were getting back to the Brown Ranch late at night, and as they came over this ridge, down over the hill was a sheep camp, and they could see a lamp and perhaps a fire or whatever. So they just shot down into the camp, not necessarily with any intent to kill anybody, but just to scare them or whatever. But in the process, it hit a horse and killed one of the horses. And so these boys got out of their wagon, of course, and hid and fired back. They could see where the shots were coming from. And then Jack Davis and his partner went on down that night to the Brown Ranch. The next morning, they got up at daylight. And this is where it's kind of an interesting scenario. In the retracing the event where these two sheep herders were killed, it was about 16 miles from the Brown Ranch up to the site where these kids were killed.
Yeah.
And down at the point of the ranch, it was 6 miles and 21 miles and whatever, and that's how we triangulated it. But he was known to be at the Brown Ranch at sunlight. And there was reference in the trial at sunrise and other at breakfast. Well, when you go down to the Brown Ranch, sunrise could happen at 10 o'clock because it was right behind a boulder, a large boulder. I mean, almost a mountain-sized boulder. So if they left at sunrise, it would have been 10 o'clock. But then they were known to be at the Boar's Nest at 12 o'clock. So at daylight, it could have been 6 like it is now, 6:30, 7:30. But they would have had to have ridden their horses 16 miles, kill the two sheep herders, and then 21 miles back there by noon, which was really an impossibility.
Yeah.
But Bora was able to convince the jury that it was possible
Yeah.
that they could have done it. And the jury went upon that notion that it was possible. But Jack Davis had developed a reputation. In fact, to just illustrate what the reputation was, one of the jurors on the jury that convicted him afterwards made a comment to a man by the name of Fuller. He said, it didn't matter whether Jack Davis was guilty or not. He was a bad enough guy that he should be hung on general principles.
Right. Yeah.
And so that type of prejudice permeated the area of the jurors and whatever else.
Yeah, in the podcast episode, I read a lot of the newspaper articles describing Jack, and just he's such a villain in all of these, and so of course everybody's going to think that he was guilty before he even walked in.
Everybody that knew him personally had a totally different opinion of him. That knew him personally, and while he was in prison, the neighbors, everybody bring him gifts, and because he did things for people.
He's making little dolls, like hair dolls and things, and
even after he was pardoned, he went to Tonopah, Nevada, became a multimillionaire, and became an icon of the state of Nevada.
Right,
known all over the United States as just this interesting icon of the West.
The fact that a governor from another state would come on his behalf and defend him, I haven't come across that in the 6 years I've been studying inmates at this site. I haven't come across that any other time.
And then a former Supreme Court justice in Utah, he came forth and said that he was totally convinced and gave him money to get him to Sparks, Nevada.
Yeah.
So the story You know, even the Statesman, in one later article, and while he was in Goldfield, Nevada, he had interest in a mine in Butte, Montana. And so he's up there looking into these interests. And while he was there, 3 men came up to the side of him as a result of something that had happened in Goldfield some years ago, where Diamondfield had witnessed a killing by 2 Union officers, testified, and they were convicted and sent to prison. As a result of that, the Union put a $200 cash prize on anybody that would kill Jack Davis. So these 3 men up in Butte, Montana, they approach him and they, in essence, tell him that he's a dead man. And he was able to turn on them and take a knife out of his own, he had it in his boot, take the knife out, and he stabbed one of the intruders. And then one of them had a .25 caliber pistol, and they shot Jack Davis in the jaw. And Davis left the auto dealer where he was at, went over to his hotel to get a gun, and announced to the people that he had to go take care of a situation. And they had blood all over him, and of course they took him to the hospital. And he wasn't able to go get the other guys. But the article said that they removed the bullet from his jaw with a pair of pliers. and it's all building up this character, of course, of Jack Davis.
Yeah, I like that he kind of gets up and he's like, somebody give me a gun. I'm going to track him down. They're like, calm down. We're taking you to the hospital.
Right. You need a doctor more than you need a gun. And so anyway, Jack Davis, goes to Goldfield, becomes a multimillionaire. One other occasion that they had the world heavyweight champion boxing match in Goldfield in 1909, I think. And anyway, it brought in reporters from all over the United States. The next morning, the Union had they had struck the mine owners, and they had taken the newspaper and they'd picket in front of the stores and whatever and try to keep people from patronizing anything to do with the miners. Well, they had taken the newspapers away from these 2 boys. And so Butch Cassidy.
Is that your next book?
Anyway, the mine owners, they get tired of the strike, so they go and they sell the newspapers on the street, and they clear the Union people out. And so the 2 boys come back and start. This next morning after the prize fight, the 2 boys are out selling their newspapers, and half a dozen Union guys took their papers away from them again and chased them down the street, and these kids ran down the street up into Jack Davis's office. And the story goes that Jack Davis comes out onto the porch, and these Union guys are all out there in front of him, and he said, with 2 revolvers, he said, "I'm going to count to 23, and if there's anybody left in the street, you'll get shot." Said by the time he got to 3, the streets were cleared.
I love that. Yeah.
And so that story, by one of the newspaper articles, appears in the New York Saturday Evening Post as an article.
That's amazing.
So he just becomes a icon of the West. And as you read more about him, the Statesman, the thing that interests me about this story is the legal aspects of it.
Yeah.
The way the whole thing was conducted with Bora, the prosecuting attorney, and James Hawley, the defense attorney, two well-known and obviously very capable attorneys going against each other. Well, with the condition that existed in Albion at the time, you had the sheepmen, cattlemen against each other. You had in that area the Mormons and the non-Mormon controversy.
Yeah.
You had community against community.
Yeah.
You had the Republicans against the Democrats. And they were, at the time, very aggressively opposing and arguing and fighting. And so in the midst of this, prejudice and all of these other things that was going on, they had a trial of a man that was so bad that he should be hung on general principles.
Everybody can unite behind that, right?
And so the jurors later on, a lot of them admitted that, he was just guilty. There, no question about it. Well, so then Hawley, at the expense of John Sparks, equivalent today of over $1 million, to defend this man that wasn't worthy to live.
Right, yeah.
Hawley takes this case to the district court, the Idaho Supreme Court, the federal district courts, federal appeal courts, the United States Supreme Court, back to the Idaho Supreme Court. Well, one of the interesting things is he was going to the Supreme Courts. The one thing that the United Supreme Court, I didn't realize this until I got into this, the Supreme Court, they do not hear on the basis of whether the man is guilty or not guilty. It's on the basis of was it a fair trial and correctly and properly conducted.
Yeah.
And it was, according to the reports that get to Supreme Court. Okay, so then before the Idaho Supreme Court, and this is after two other men come forth and confess that they killed the two sheep herders.
Yeah.
As the newspaper reported it after they appeared before the Board of Pardons and made this confession, the Statesman reports, and this is the other interesting thing, the Statesman was a Republican paper, and the Capital News was a Democrat paper, and they were at each other.
On everything.
On everything.
But this in particular,
So the morning after they have these two confessed individuals, the Statesman reports that it happened, but they said that the Board of Pardons felt like that the leg of justice was being pulled.
Right. Oh my gosh.
And that they were confessing this killing to try to protect Diamondfield Jack.
Yeah. It was just another ruse. These two were just shills, and then they would get off on self-defense. Okay, so then they tried Jeff Gray and found him innocent based on self-defense. Okay, now after this, they wrote up a report that they did not believe that Jack Davis shot or killed these two men. Yeah.
That Gray did it in self-defense. Okay, so then with this, two other men has confessed, and Jack Davis, nothing's happened. He's still convicted of of murder.
Right.
Hawley goes to the Supreme Court and in his argument says, as a result of this hearing and this conclusion, if A murders B and A is convicted and sentenced to hang, and a year later B, who supposedly was murdered, shows up in the court, that there isn't anything you can do to...
Yeah.
I mean, A is still convicted of murder.
Right.
So the response was that, it is basically true that if they're convicted of murder, they can't erase that.
Yeah.
And the Supreme Court said that our remedy to that situation is the Board of Pardons. They can pardon that person. So the Board of Pardons, they then sat down and changed the sentence of death to life in prison. And yet they didn't believe that he even killed him.
Right.
I mean, it's beyond your imagination as to what was going on, and this prejudice and this infighting. The governor, the Secretary of State, and the Lieutenant Governor were all Republicans.
Yeah.
And it was, a Republican. Bora apparently had tremendous power over the governor and the others. Well, it wasn't until Governor Hunt, who was a Democrat, was elected, and another Democrat, I think Secretary of State, that they ultimately pardoned Jack Davis. And this man was unjustly convicted all that period of time, set in prison. And, there's an interesting law going on right now in our legislature about compensating
wrongfully convicted
people, which didn't exist at the time. Right. But anyway, the Statesman made an observation in one of their newspaper articles that the Jack Davis trial was perhaps the greatest trial in the history of Idaho, if not in the entire West.
Yeah. It's amazing.
But it really is a fascinating story, and as you dig into it, more and more of the details, they're just continual, new, interesting.
Reading your book, I could feel just that love of research that I get too when I dig into these inmate stories, and it's amazing that you dedicated so much time and work and effort into uncovering this story. So
well, and it's interesting. It's just right on the surface.
Yeah.
Today.
Right.
I get an email today, and I'll contact this lady, and I'll make a trip there, or she'll make a trip here, and she'll look over all the evidence that I've got. And
we might have to do a follow-up when you find out what.
Maybe. It would just be fun to find out where he came from.
Yeah.
Who he was. Gosh. And he makes a statement that his father was the leader of the Black Brigade during the Civil War. And there was a black, but it wasn't a Davis that was in charge of it. So
we're going to track this down.
Oh, yeah. It's amazing how things happen.
Yeah.
How the right person with the right... There's one bit of information that I haven't tracked down yet, and it could lead to a real possibility. When he first came into the area, he was down in the Burley area. And this was before he went to work for Sparks Herald. Mm-hmm. And he went to apply for a job from a man by the name of Schutte. And as the story goes, and Davis, I think, is the one that tells the story, Schutte, it's also kind of collaborated. Davis says that he went in and applied. And when he talked to Schutte, he told him, about himself and whatever. And he said Schutte went into the house, came back out with a rifle, and ordered him off the premise. And the conversation, something to the effect, "You must know my parents," and that was the reason that he was scaring him off. Well, so what I need to do, and this is one of the things that we'll research out.
Yeah.
Let's find out where Shooty came from.
Yeah.
And who some of his parents were, or what, maybe some historical fact of something going on then in that area where he is from, that the name make him up. So, we just, I have his name right on side of my computer, and it's one of the things that I've been kind of holding out as maybe the ace.
Oh my gosh! Well, we'll have to have a part 2 with you in maybe next season, and
hopefully
find out what you came up with. Because I've spent hours trying to track him down myself, just through Ancestry and other things. And if he's connected with Civil War, is like I haven't heard that. So that's something that.
Well, the lady that gave that testimony was the daughter of the sheriff at the time, and she said that the two of them tracked down that the sheriff and him were both born in the same area where Jefferson Davis was.
That's so wild.
And yet, he was born in Wheeling and New Jersey, and and so you don't know where the truth lies.
Yeah, such a fascinating story. Well, thank you so much, Max, for coming in and being here, writing this book. I recommend everybody come to the Old Pen, check out Diamondfield, Finding the Real Jack Davis by Max Black. It's a fantastic read if you're into history, if you're into research. Max goes in full depth into all these amazing things that he talked about today. So definitely pick that up. Thank you so much for being on today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, take care. Do your own time, do your own number, stay healthy, stay indoors. Let's get through this together. If you enjoyed Behind Gray Walls, please rate, review, and subscribe so others can find our podcast. If you're interested in more Old Idaho Penitentiary information and to see mugshots of the inmates featured in this episode, follow the Old Idaho Penitentiary on Instagram and Facebook. If you want to learn more about the Idaho State Historical Society and its other sites, follow ID State Historical Society on Instagram or visit history.idaho.gov. If you have a question or comment for the hosts, please email us at behindgraywalls@gmail.com.